In this video, you will hear 5 horror stories that you will not be able to watch until the end. Anyone under the age of 18, please do not watch this video. Let's go. Story 1. The Beast of the Bell Tower. Location: Sainte-Chapelle Cathedral, Paris, France. Part 1. The Call. Paris in the dead of night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind rattling through the narrow streets. Father Lucien stood before Sainte-Chapelle Cathedral, the towering Gothic structure looming above him like a stone sentinel. The cathedral was one of Paris's oldest and most revered buildings, but it had recently gained a dark reputation. For the past several weeks, the bell in the old tower had begun ringing on its own, the deep, mournful toll reverberating across the city at ungodly hours. It was always the same. Just after midnight, the bell would ring, though no hand touched its rope. Lucien shivered as he gazed up at the bell tower, its windows dark and gaping like the empty eyes of a skull. The tower had been sealed off centuries ago, after an accident that had claimed the life of the bell ringer. Or so the story went. No one had ventured up those stairs in decades, not since the church had ordered it closed. Yet now the bell rang as if to remind the city of its dark past. Lucien wasn't a man given to superstition. His faith was strong, his belief in the divine unshakable. But something about this place, about this assignment, filled him with a creeping sense of dread. The church had tasked him with investigating the strange occurrences at Sainte-Chapelle, but no one had told him what he might find. Only that it was his duty to uncover the truth. He adjusted the collar of his cassock, took a deep breath, and pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the cathedral. The interior of Sainte-Chapelle was vast and shadowy, the tall stained glass windows casting fragmented colors across the stone floor. The air inside was thick with the scent of incense and old wood, and the silence was oppressive. Lucien's footsteps echoed loudly as he made his way down the nave, the flickering candlelight casting long, eerie shadows. He had been told the entrance to the bell tower was hidden, sealed off behind an old wooden panel in one of the side chapels, the Chapel of St. Michael, if he recalled correctly. As he walked, he felt a strange heaviness in the air, as if the cathedral itself was watching him. Lucien reached the chapel and found the panel just as he had been told. It was dusty and covered in cobwebs, the wood faded and worn with age. With a quiet prayer on his lips, he reached out and pushed against the panel. To his surprise, it moved easily, sliding aside to reveal a narrow, spiraling staircase that disappeared into the darkness above. The bell tower. Lucien hesitated at the foot of the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The staircase was old, decaying, the stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. A faint musty smell wafted down from the tower, mingling with the ever-present scent of incense. "May God be with me," he whispered, gripping the crucifix that hung around his neck. With a deep breath, he began his ascent. The stairs were steep and narrow, twisting upward into the darkness like a coiled serpent. Lucien's hand slid along the cold stone wall for balance, his other hand clutching his lantern. The light barely pierced the thick gloom, and the air grew colder the higher he climbed. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft echo of his footsteps. But as he climbed, he began to hear something else. A low rhythmic sound like the steady beat of a heart. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but as he ascended further, it grew louder, more distinct. Thump, thump, thump. Lucien stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The sound was coming from above, from the bell tower. He swallowed hard, pushing aside his fear. It was probably just the wind, or perhaps some old piece of machinery still clanking away in the tower. Nothing more. Still, the noise set his nerves on edge, and with each step, the sense of unease deepened. The walls felt closer, the air heavier, as if the tower itself was pressing down on him. His lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows on the stone. Thump, 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 The sound grew louder, more insistent, and Lucien quickened his pace. He was close now. He could feel it. The bell tower was just ahead. He rounded a corner, the last flight of stairs coming into view. But as he stepped forward, something cold and wet brushed against his face. He recoiled, raising his lantern. A cobweb, thick and sticky, stretched across the stairwell. It clung to his face and clothes, and for a moment, he felt a strange, irrational fear, as if the web was alive, as if something was waiting in the darkness to ensnare him. He brushed it aside, cursing himself for his foolishness. "Get a grip, Lucien," he muttered under his breath. "You're a man of God." With renewed determination, he climbed the final steps and reached the top of the tower. The bell chamber was vast and open, the cold night air seeping through the cracks in the stone walls. The bell itself hung in the center of the room, massive and ancient, its bronze surface tarnished with age. Chains and ropes dangled from the ceiling, connected to the mechanism that once allowed the bell to be rung. Lucien stepped forward, his heart racing. The chamber was still, silent. But there was something wrong. The air felt thick with something unholy, something that didn't belong in a place of worship. He could feel it, like a weight pressing down on his chest. And then, from the shadows, came the growl. It was low, guttural, vibrating through the stone walls like the distant rumble of thunder. Lucien froze, his hand tightening on his lantern as the sound echoed through the chamber. The shadows seemed to shift, to writhe, and out of the darkness, something began to emerge. The Bell Golem. Part 2. The Bell Golem Awakens. The creature that stepped out of the shadows was a hulking mass of stone, iron, and rusted metal. Its form was roughly humanoid, but its body was a grotesque amalgamation of discarded church bells, shattered fragments of stone statues, and twisted metal beams. Its arms were thick and heavy, ending in jagged claws that scraped against the stone floor with a sickening screech. Its head was misshapen, a twisted parody of a face with hollow eye sockets, and a mouth that looked as though it had been formed from the cracks in the metal. The Bell Golem's chest pulsed with a dull, rhythmic thump, the same sound Lucien had heard echoing up the stairs. Each beat reverberated through the chamber, shaking the very air around it. Thump, thump, thump. Lucien's heart raced, his breath catching in his throat. This was no ordinary creature. This was something ancient, something born of dark magic and twisted alchemy. He had heard stories, whispers of an alchemist who had sought to protect the cathedral centuries ago, who had created something unnatural, something that had eventually turned on its creator, the Bell Golem. The golem's eyes, though hollow, seemed to lock onto him, and Lucien felt a surge of primal fear. The creature was watching him, assessing him, as though it were deciding whether he was a threat or prey. Lucien took a step back, his lantern trembling in his hand. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. How could such a thing exist? How could something so monstrous be here in the house of God? The creature took a slow, deliberate step forward, its heavy footfalls shaking the floor beneath it. Lucien could see the faint glow of molten metal in the cracks between the golem's stone plates, like the dying embers of a forge fire. It radiated a terrible heat, and the air around it shimmered with the faint scent of burnt metal. Lucien's mouth was dry, his mind screaming for him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. The golem growled again, the sound vibrating through the air like a bell tolling deep underground. Its massive hand reached out, the jagged metal claws scraping against the floor as it extended toward him. Lucien's instincts kicked in, and he stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. His lantern clattered to the floor, the light flickering and casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. He had to get out. He had to escape. But the stairs were behind the golem, blocked by its hulking form. Panic surged through him, and he glanced around the chamber, searching for another way out. His eyes landed on a narrow window near the far wall, just wide enough for him to squeeze through. It was his only chance. The golem took another step forward, the floor groaning beneath its immense weight. Lucien could feel the heat radiating from the creature, the air growing stiflingly hot. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he backed away, his heart racing. "Stay back!" he shouted, though his voice trembled with fear. "I am a man of God. I command you to stay back." The golem didn't react. It moved with the slow, deliberate purpose of a predator stalking its prey. Its eyes, though hollow, seemed to gleam with a malevolent intelligence, as if it understood the fear it was instilling in him. Lucien's back hit the wall, and he realized with a sickening jolt that he was trapped. There was no way to reach the window without getting past the creature. Desperation clawed at him, and he fumbled for the crucifix around his neck, gripping it tightly. He muttered a quick prayer under his breath, hoping, praying, that it would give him the strength to face this abomination. The golem growled again, its massive hand reaching out toward him, the claws inches from his face. Lucien could feel the heat radiating from its molten core, the metal plates creaking and groaning as the creature loomed over him. And then, without warning, the bell tolled. The sound was deafening, a deep, resonant boom that shook the entire tower. Lucien winced, clapping his hands to his ears as the bell's toll reverberated through the chamber. The golem recoiled, its hand jerking back as if the sound had hurt it. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the creature seemed to falter, its movement slowing as the bell continued to toll. Lucien's heart leapt. The bell, it was the key. The creature was tied to the bell tower, to the very thing it had once been created to protect. Perhaps the tolling of the bell was weakening it, disrupting whatever dark magic had given it life. The golem staggered, its molten eyes flickering, the rhythmic thumping in its chest growing weaker. Thump, thump, thump. Lucien's mind raced. If he could get the bell to ring again, perhaps it would stop the creature altogether. His eyes darted to the mechanism in the center of the room, the ropes and chains that controlled the bell's swing. If he could reach it, he might be able to trigger the bell manually, to force it to ring again and again until the golem was destroyed. But the golem was still between him and the mechanism, its hulking form blocking his path. Lucien swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had no choice. He had to act. With a surge of adrenaline, Lucien darted to the side, skirting along the edge of the room, his eyes locked on the bell's mechanism. The golem growled in response, turning its lumbering body toward him, but it moved slowly, its movements sluggish and strained. Lucien reached the ropes and chains just as the golem's claws swiped through the air, narrowly missing his head. He grabbed hold of the thick rope, his hands trembling as he pulled with all his strength. The bell swung. For a moment there was silence, and then the bell tolled again, louder and deeper than before. The golem let out a roar of pain, its molten core flickering wildly as the bell's sound echoed through the chamber. The creature staggered, its body shaking as the magic that held it together began to unravel. Lucien pulled the rope again, and the bell tolled once more. The golem collapsed to its knees, its massive form shuddering as the molten metal in its chest began to cool, the heat fading from the air. Thump, thump, thump. The sound grew weaker, fainter, until finally the golem's chest stopped moving altogether. And then, with a deafening crash, the creature fell apart. The stone plates that made up its body crumbled to the floor, the metal beams and bell fragments clattering down in a heap of twisted wreckage. The air grew still, the oppressive heat fading as the golem's magic was extinguished. Lucien stood there, his hands still gripping the rope, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had done it. The golem was defeated. But as the silence settled over the bell tower, Lucien couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The air still felt thick with something dark and ancient, something that had been awakened by the bell's toll. And deep in the shadows, something moved. Part 3. The Legacy of the Alchemist. Lucien stood frozen, his hands still gripping the rope, his eyes locked on the pile of rubble that had once been the bell golem. The tower was silent now, the oppressive atmosphere that had weighed so heavily on him lifted. but the sense of dread remained. Something moved in the shadows. His breath caught in his throat as he slowly turned, the lantern's flickering light casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The air in the bell tower felt colder, heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Lucian's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the chamber, searching for the source of the movement. The rubble of the golem lay still, but something else was here. Something that had been hiding in the dark. And then, he saw it. In the far corner of the chamber, partially hidden by the shadows, was a figure. At first, Lucian thought it was another piece of the golem, just a discarded fragment of stone or metal. But as he looked closer, he realized it was something else entirely. The figure was hunched over, its form twisted and unnatural, like a man who had been bent and broken by the weight of centuries. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were wide and sunken, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. Lucian's blood ran cold. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. It was dressed in tattered, filthy robes, and its fingers were long and thin, tipped with sharp, blackened nails. It wasn't human. Lucien took a step back, his hand tightening around the crucifix around his neck. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The creature before him was no golem. It was something else, something far older. The alchemist. The stories flooded back to him. The tales of the man who had once created the bell golem. The alchemist who had sought to protect the cathedral from invaders, but who had lost control of his creation. The golem had turned on him, crushing him beneath its immense weight. But the alchemist's spirit had never left the tower. It had been trapped here, bound to the very thing he had created. Lucian's mouth went dry as the alchemist stepped closer, its sunken eyes fixed on him. There was no malice in its gaze, only a deep, consuming sorrow. The creature's mouth moved as if it were trying to speak, but no sound came out. Lucian swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. What do you want?" The alchemist's fingers twitched, and for a moment, Lucien thought he saw a flicker of recognition in its eyes, an awareness, a spark of the man it had once been. And then, the creature's mouth opened wide, and from the depths of its throat came a sound that chilled Lucien to the bone. A scream. It was a low, mournful wail, filled with centuries of pain and suffering, and it reverberated through the tower like the tolling of the bell. Lucien staggered back, his hands flying to his ears as the sound pierced through him. The scream was unbearable, filled with a sorrow that seemed to drag him down into the depths of despair. It was the scream of a man who had lost everything, his life, his soul, his very humanity. The alchemist stepped closer, the sound growing louder, more intense, as if it were feeding off Lucian's fear. The creature's pale, translucent skin seemed to shimmer in the lantern's light, and its eyes burned with a terrible, unnatural hunger. Lucian's breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away, his heart racing. He couldn't fight this. He couldn't stop it, but he had to try. With a trembling hand, Lucien raised the crucifix around his neck, holding it out toward the creature. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this place." The alchemist's scream faltered for a moment, the sound dipping in pitch, but it didn't stop. The creature's eyes flickered, and it hesitated, as if the words had stirred something within it, some distant memory of the man it had once been. Lucien took a step forward, his voice steadying as he clutched the crucifix tighter. "I command you to leave. You have no power here." The alchemist's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Lucien thought he saw a flash of anger in its gaze. The creature's hands twitched, its fingers curling into fists, and the scream grew louder, more intense, the sound vibrating through the very stone walls of the tower. Lucien's heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. He could feel the air growing colder, the shadows closing in around him, But he couldn't stop. He had to finish this. "In the name of God, I command you to return to the darkness from which you came!" he shouted, his voice filled with conviction. "You are not welcome here!" The alchemist let out a final, piercing wail, the sound so loud and intense that it rattled the very foundations of the tower. The creature's body shook, its pale skin flickering like a dying flame. And then, with a deafening crash, it collapsed. The scream stopped. Lucian stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart racing. The alchemist's body lay crumpled on the floor, its twisted form still and lifeless. It was over, or so he thought. As the silence settled over the tower, Lucian felt a strange sensation wash over him. A feeling of unease, of something unfinished. The air still felt thick with darkness, as if the very walls of the tower were saturated with the alchemist's sorrow and rage. And then, from the shadows, came a low, rumbling growl. Lucian's blood turned to ice. The bell golem was stirring. Part 4. The Final Toll. The ground beneath Lucian's feet trembled as the pile of rubble that had once been the bell golem began to shift. The sound of grinding stone and creaking metal filled the air, and Lucian's heart sank. It wasn't over. The pieces of the golem began to move, slowly at first, but with increasing speed and purpose. Shattered fragments of stone rolled across the floor, clattering together like the pieces of a broken puzzle. Rusted metal beams creaked and groaned as they lifted themselves off the ground, fitting back into place with sickening precision. The golem was reforming. Lucian's pulse quickened as he watched the creature reassemble itself, the pieces snapping together with a force that shook the entire tower. The golem's body grew larger, more menacing with each passing second, and the air grew thick with the oppressive heat of its molten core. Thump, thump, thump. The rhythmic beating sound returned, louder now, more intense, as the golem's chest began to glow with the same molten light that had flickered through its body before. The creature's eyes, those hollow, empty sockets, burned with an unnatural fire. Lucian's hands trembled as he stepped back, his mind racing. He had destroyed the golem once, but it hadn't been enough. The bell was the key. The sound had weakened it, had disrupted the magic that held it together. If he could ring the bell again and keep it ringing, perhaps he could stop the golem for good. But the creature was already on its feet, its massive form towering over him. It moved with a purpose now, its molten core pulsing with energy, and Lucian could feel the heat radiating from its body like the breath of a furnace. The golem growled, the sound deep and guttural, like the grinding of stone against stone. Its eyes locked onto him, and Lucian felt a surge of primal fear. He was no match for this creature, not physically, but he had something the golem didn't: the bell. Lucian turned and sprinted toward the bell's mechanism, his heart pounding in his chest. The golem let out a roar of anger and lunged after him, its heavy footfalls shaking the floor. The ropes and chains that controlled the bell swung wildly, and Lucian reached for them just as the golem's claws swiped through the air behind him. He grabbed hold of the rope and pulled with all his strength. The bell swung. The sound was deafening, a deep, resonant toll that shook the very walls of the tower. The golem staggered, its molten eyes flickering as the sound reverberated through its body. Lucian didn't stop. He pulled the rope again and again, each toll of the bell sending shockwaves through the air. The golem roared in pain, its body shaking violently as the magic that held it together began to unravel. The molten metal in its chest flickered wildly, and cracks began to appear in its stone plates. But it wasn't enough. The golem was still standing, still moving, its eyes burning with a fierce, unrelenting rage. Lucian's arms ached, his muscles burning with the effort of pulling the rope, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep the bell ringing. He had to stop the creature. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of the golem's heartbeat grew weaker, fainter, but it wasn't gone. Lucian pulled the rope one last time, the bell swinging with all the force he could muster. The toll echoed through the tower, louder than any that had come before. The golem let out a final guttural roar, its body shaking violently as the magic that held it together shattered. The molten metal in its chest flared, then dimmed, and the creature's stone plates crumbled to the ground in a pile of rubble. It was over. Lucien stood there, gasping for breath, his hands still gripping the rope. The bell swayed gently above him, its toll fading into the distance. The air was still, the oppressive heat gone, and the tower was once again silent. The bell golem was destroyed. Lucian collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The crucifix around his neck felt heavy, as if it had absorbed some of the weight of the battle he had just fought. He had defeated the golem, but the cost had been high. The tower was empty now, save for the pile of rubble that had once been the bell golem. But Lucian knew that the creature's legacy would live on. The dark magic that had given it life had been extinguished, but the scars it had left behind would never fully heal. Saint-Chapelle would never be the same. Lucian rose to his feet, his legs shaking as he made his way back to the stairs. He had done what he came here to do. He had uncovered the truth of the bell tower, and he had put an end to the creature that had haunted it for centuries. But as he descended the narrow, spiraling staircase, the toll of the bell still echoed in his mind, and deep in the shadows of the tower, something stirred. Asterisk, asterisk, the end, asterisk, asterisk. Story 2. The Forgotten Prison. Location, Kilmainham Jail, Dublin, Ireland. Part 1. Into the Jail. Declan O'Connor had always been drawn to places where others feared to tread. He thrived on the adrenaline that came with breaking into old, forgotten spaces, the remnants of a past world left to decay in silence. Kilmainham Jail, with its grim history and notorious reputation, was a challenge he couldn't resist. The sky over Dublin was a thick blanket of clouds, blotting out the moonlight as Declan stood outside the high, weathered walls of the prison. Kilmainham had once been home to Ireland's most dangerous criminals, but it had long since fallen into disrepair. Its imposing structure now nothing more than a hollow shell of what it once was. Officially, it was closed to the public for years of structural concerns, though rumors of hauntings had added to the mystique. Declan had heard the whispers, strange sounds, apparitions, the feeling of being watched. It was exactly the kind of place he loved to explore. Declan adjusted his backpack, which contained a camera, flashlight, and a few other essentials, and glanced up at the dark silhouette of the jail. The iron gate, though rusted, stood tall and foreboding. A thick padlock hung from the latch, but Declan had already scouted a way in, an old broken window near the back, large enough for him to squeeze through. Without another moment's hesitation, he made his way around the perimeter, the cold night air biting at his skin. The sounds of the city faded into the background, leaving him with only the crunch of gravel under his boots and the occasional distant echo of a car horn. It didn't take long to find the window. He crouched, shining his flashlight inside. It opened into a storage room filled with rotting furniture and rusted iron bars, relics of the prison's dark history. With a grunt, Declan hoisted himself through the window, landing softly on the dusty floor. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp stone and rot, the cold even more biting now that he was out of the wind. He took a moment to adjust to the dim light, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The room was just as he expected, decaying, forgotten, and eerily quiet. Old wooden chairs lay broken on the ground, their legs twisted and splintered. A few pieces of rusted iron that had once been part of the prison's security were scattered around. The room was otherwise unremarkable, just another relic of the past left to crumble. But the real thrill lay deeper within the prison. Declan stepped out into the narrow hallway that connected the storage room to the rest of the building. The walls were lined with crumbling plaster, the ceiling sagging with age. His footsteps echoed unnervingly in the silence. It was colder than he'd expected. Every breath he took came out in a visible puff of steam, and a strange sense of foreboding began to creep in as he ventured further. Kilmainham Jail was a labyrinth. The layout was designed to keep prisoners confined and controlled, with narrow corridors and cramped cells that radiated out from central walkways. Declan had done his research, studying old maps of the place before sneaking in. He knew that the most infamous cells, the ones that had held political prisoners during Ireland's turbulent history, were in the heart of the jail. That was where he was headed. He passed several empty cells along the way, their iron doors hanging crookedly on their hinges. The cells were small, barely large enough to fit a bed and a small stool, though most of them were now empty. Declan shone his light into each one as he passed, half expecting to find something, anything that might explain the stories of hauntings. But all he saw was dust and decay, until he reached the end of the corridor. There, in the last cell, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, the room was not empty. There was a chain, long and rusted, coiled in the center of the floor. Declan frowned. The chain wasn't attached to anything, just lying there, as though someone had dropped it and forgotten about it. But it looked fresh, as if it had only recently been placed there. He stepped closer, shining his light on the chain. Something about it made his skin crawl. The way it was coiled, the way the links seemed to shift ever so slightly under the beam of his flashlight. Then, from somewhere deeper in the prison, he heard it. The sound of chains dragging across the floor. Declan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The noise was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, as though someone, or something, was moving through the jail, dragging chains behind them. He turned his head toward the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. It was coming from the central part of the prison, where the largest cells were located. He swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. This was why he had come, wasn't it? For the thrill, for the chance to see if the rumors were true. He wasn't about to turn back now, not when he was so close. He steeled himself and began walking toward the source of the sound, his footsteps careful and quiet. The further he went, the more the temperature seemed to drop. His breath was visible in the dim light, and a faint mist began to cling to the walls. The sound of the chains grew louder, though it was still distant. Declan's mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just the wind, or some piece of old machinery still creaking away in the bowels of the prison. He clung to those rational explanations as he moved deeper into the jail. But then he heard something else. Whispers. Faint, barely audible, but there. A murmur of voices, too quiet to make out but unmistakable in their presence. They came from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the halls like the ghostly remnants of forgotten conversations. Declan stopped, turning his flashlight in every direction, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, twisting together into an incomprehensible cacophony. His pulse quickened, his breath coming in short gasps. Then from the darkness ahead came a voice, clear, cold, and unmistakably real. Come. Part 2. The Hollowed. The voice chilled Declan to the core. It was not a scream, not a shout, but a single word. Soft, inviting, yet filled with an underlying menace. It echoed through the prison's stone corridors, bouncing off the walls like a command that couldn't be disobeyed. Declan's hands shook as he tightened his grip on the flashlight. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. Had it really been a voice? Or had his imagination finally started playing tricks on him in the eerie silence of Kilmainham Jail? But no, it had been real. Come. The word echoed again, softer this time, but still unmistakable. It was coming from further inside the jail, from deeper within the shadows where the cells were older, darker, more isolated. A rush of adrenaline surged through Declan. This was what he lived for, the unknown, the thrill of the unexplained. He forced himself to push forward, each step heavier than the last as he ventured deeper into the prison's forgotten bowels. The dragging of chains grew louder now, more distinct, and the whispers seemed to intensify, swirling around him like a chorus of unseen voices. The temperature had dropped even further, the air so cold that Declan's breath came out in thick clouds of mist. His heart raced in his chest, but he pressed on, determined to see what lay ahead. The corridor twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until they felt like they were closing in around him. The cells here were older, the iron bars rusted and bent, the doors hanging crookedly from their hinges. Declan could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the countless souls who had been imprisoned here, forgotten by time. As he turned a corner, the beam of his flashlight illuminated something that made his blood run cold. In the center of the corridor stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and draped in what appeared to be the tattered remnants of a prison uniform. But it wasn't the clothing that made Declan's heart skip a beat. It was the figure's face, or rather, the lack of one. Where the figure's face should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, blank and pale, as though someone had erased its features entirely. The hollow space where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been stared back at him, a faceless mask of flesh that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Declan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, motionless, its head tilted ever so slightly as though it were watching him despite having no eyes. The whispers grew louder. Declan's hand trembled as he slowly backed away, his flashlight flickering in the cold air. The figure took a step forward, the sound of chains dragging across the stone floor filling the air. Declan's breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. Another step, and then another. The figure moved closer, its head tilting further to the side, as though studying him. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost curious, like a predator sizing up its prey. Declan finally found his voice. "Who are you?" he stammered, his voice shaky in the cold air. The figure didn't respond. It took another step forward, the chains it dragged scraping against the stone with a sound that set Declan's teeth on edge. Declan took another step back, his heart racing. He needed to get out of here. He needed to leave. But the figure was blocking the only way out, and every step he took backwards seemed to draw it closer. And then, from the shadows, came more movement. Declan's flashlight flickered again, and this time, when it stabilized, he saw them. More figures emerging from the darkness. Faceless, hollowed figures, each one dragging a length of rusted chain behind them. They moved in unison, their heads tilting in the same eerie manner as they stepped toward him. The whispers swirled around him, louder now, more frantic, as though the prison itself was alive with voices. Declan's breath came in ragged gasps as the figures closed in, their chains scraping against the floor in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He backed up against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no way out. They had him cornered. The figures stopped just a few feet away, their hollow faces staring at him, if they could stare at all. The lead figure raised its arm, the chain in its hand clinking softly as it dragged it forward. Declan's pulse quickened as the figure extended the chain toward him, as though offering it to him. His mind screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then the chain touched him. The moment the cold metal brushed against his skin, something changed. The whispers ceased, the air grew still, and for a brief moment there was silence. And then the pain began. It started as a sharp, burning sensation where the chain had touched his skin, but it quickly spread, searing through his body like fire. Declan gasped, his body convulsing as the pain intensified, radiating outward from the point of contact. His vision blurred, the world around him spinning as his legs gave out beneath him. The figures moved closer, their chains clinking softly as they surrounded him. Declan's mind raced, panic overtaking every rational thought. The pain was unbearable, like his very soul was being pulled from his body. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. Only a strangled gasp as the faceless figures closed in, their chains wrapping around his limbs, pulling him into the darkness. The last thing Declan saw before the world faded to black was the blank, hollow face of the lead figure, staring down at him with an eerie, unnatural calm. And then, there was nothing. Part 3. Shadows of the Forgotten. When Declan awoke, he was lying on cold, hard stone. His body ached, his skin burning as though it had been seared by fire. His head pounded, and for a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The world around him was a blur, dark and unfocused, and the only sound he could hear was the faint clinking of chains. The chains. Memories flooded back. Kilmainham jail, the faceless figures, the chains that had wrapped around him and dragged him into the shadows. His heart raced as he tried to sit up, but his limbs felt heavy, as though they were weighed down by something. He looked down and saw them. The chains. They were wrapped around his wrists and ankles, rusted and heavy, binding him to the floor. His breath caught in his throat as he struggled to pull free, but the chains wouldn't budge. They were too tight, too strong. Panic surged through him. He was trapped. The air around him was cold, colder than it had been before, and the walls of the prison seemed to press in around him. He could barely see in the dim light, but he could make out the shapes of the cells lining the corridor, their iron bars casting long shadows across the floor. And then he heard it. The whispering. It started softly, just a faint murmur in the distance, but it grew louder with each passing moment, echoing through the prison like the voices of the damned. The sound sent a chill down his spine, and he struggled against the chains, desperate to break free. But it was no use. The whispers grew louder, and from the shadows he saw them. The figures. The Hollowed. They emerged from the darkness, their faceless heads tilting as they moved toward him, their chains dragging behind them. Declan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched them approach, their blank faces reflecting no emotion, no malice, only an eerie, unnatural calm. The lead figure stepped forward, its chain clinking softly as it came to stand before him. Declan's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared up at the figure, his mind racing. He had to escape. He had to get out of here. But the chains held him fast, and the Hollowed watched him with their empty, hollow faces. Why are you doing this?" Declan whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It simply raised its arm, the chain in its hand clinking as it moved. The cold metal brushed against Declan's skin, and he winced, expecting the searing pain to return. But instead, something else happened. The moment the chain touched him, the whispers changed. They grew softer, more distinct, and Declan realized that he could understand them. They weren't just whispers. They were voices, voices of the forgotten. They took us. They broke us. The words were faint, barely audible, but they were there, echoing in his mind like a distant memory. Declan's heart raced as he listened, the voices filling his head, drowning out his own thoughts. We are the Hollowed, the lost, the forgotten. The figure moved closer, its blank face mere inches from Declan's. He could feel the cold emanating from its skin, the emptiness behind its gaze. And then, without warning, the figure reached up and touched his face. Declan gasped as the world around him seemed to shift. The prison walls faded, the cold stone beneath him disappeared, and for a brief moment, he was somewhere else. He was standing in a narrow cell, the air thick with the smell of sweat and blood. Chains clinked in the darkness, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. Declan's heart raced as he realized where he was. Kilmainham jail. But not as he had seen it before. This was the past. The cell door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. A guard, dressed in the uniform of the prison. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge Declan's presence. Instead, He walked straight to the corner of the cell where another figure was huddled, a prisoner shackled to the wall. The prisoner's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his skin pale and sickly. He didn't move as the guard approached, didn't react as the guard reached for the chain that bound him. The guard's voice was cold, emotionless. "It's time." The prisoner didn't resist. He didn't fight. He simply stood, his chains rattling as the guard led him from the cell. Declan watched, unable to move, unable to speak, as the prisoner was led down the corridor, his head bowed in defeat. The walls of the prison were damp, the air thick with despair, and the whispers, those same haunting whispers, echoed through the halls. They led the prisoner to a room at the end of the corridor, a small dark chamber lit only by the flickering light of a single lantern. The air was stifling, and the smell of death hung heavy in the air. The guard didn't hesitate. He shackled the prisoner to the wall, his movements quick and efficient, as though this was something he had done countless times before. And then, without a word, he left. Declan stood in the corner of the room, watching as the prisoner slumped against the wall, his chains clinking softly in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Declan could feel the weight of the prison pressing down on him, suffocating him. He tried to move, tried to reach out to the prisoner, but his body wouldn't obey. He was trapped, just as the prisoner was trapped, shackled by the weight of the past. The prisoner raised his head, his hollow eyes meeting Declan's, and then, with a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he spoke. "We are the Hollowed." The world shifted again, and Declan was back in the present, lying on the cold stone floor of Kilmainham jail, the hollowed figures standing over him. The chains around his wrists and ankles felt heavier now, the weight of them pulling him down into the darkness. He was one of them. Part 4. Becoming the Hollowed. The realization struck Declan like a punch to the gut. The chains that bound him, the faceless figures surrounding him, they weren't here to torment him. They were here to claim him. He had crossed into their world, the world of the Hollowed. The whispers filled his head, each voice a fractured echo of the souls who had been forgotten in this place. Kilmainham jail was not just a prison for the living. It had become a tomb for the souls who had perished here, their identities stripped away, leaving behind only hollow shells of their former selves. Declan's heart raced as he struggled against the chains, but they were unyielding, their rusted links tightening with every movement. The Hollowed stood in a silent circle around him, their heads tilted as they watched, their blank faces betraying nothing. "We are the Hollowed," one of them whispered, its voice barely more than a breath of wind. "We were forgotten," another murmured. The chains around Declan's wrists and ankles tightened, the cold metal biting into his skin. He could feel something pulling at him, dragging him down, not just physically, but spiritually. It was as if the chains were reaching inside him, unraveling his very essence. "We were lost," the voices whispered. "Now you are one of us." Declan's breath came in short, ragged gasps as the weight of their words sank in. He was becoming one of them. His identity, his sense of self was slipping away, dissolving into the cold, empty void that surrounded him. "No," he gasped, his voice weak, desperate. I'm not like you." But the Hollowed didn't respond. They simply watched, their blank faces reflecting his growing panic. The chains clinked softly as they shifted, their movements slow and deliberate, as though time itself had no meaning in this place. Declan's mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to break free from the chains that bound him. But the more he struggled, the tighter they grew, until it felt as though they were crushing him, suffocating him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his head with the voices of the damned. "Join us! Become one of the forgotten!" The air grew colder, the shadows lengthening as the Hollowed moved closer, their chains clinking softly in the darkness. Declan could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on him, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. His vision blurred, the world around him spinning as his strength began to fade. He could feel himself slipping away, his identity dissolving into the void. "No," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "I can't." But the Hollowed were relentless. They reached for him, their chains wrapping around his limbs, pulling him down into the shadows. The whispers filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self. "We are the Hollowed. We are the Forgotten." Declan's vision darkened, the world fading to black as the chains tightened around him, pulling him down into the cold, empty void. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, the voices of the forgotten souls who had been imprisoned in Kilmainham jail echoing in his mind. And then, in the darkness, he felt something else. A spark, a flicker of something deep inside him, something that hadn't yet been consumed by the Hollowed. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough. Declan focused on that spark, clinging to it with every ounce of strength he had left. He wasn't like them. He wasn't one of the forgotten. He still had his memories, his identity, his sense of self. He could still fight. With a surge of adrenaline, Declan pulled against the chains, his muscles straining as he fought to break free. The Hollowed whispered around him, their voices growing louder, more frantic, but he ignored them. He focused on the spark inside him, the last remnant of who he was. The chains tightened, digging into his skin, but Declan didn't stop. He pulled harder, his body trembling with the effort. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, but he pushed them aside, focusing on the light inside him. And then, with a final, desperate effort, the chains broke. Declan gasped as the weight of the chains fell away, his body collapsing onto the cold stone floor. His heart raced in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he struggled to regain his strength. The Hollowed stepped back, their blank faces tilting as they watched him. For the first time, Declan saw something in their movements. Hesitation. He wasn't one of them. Not yet. Declan staggered to his feet, his legs trembling as he backed away from the Hollowed. The whispers still filled the air, but they were quieter now, less insistent. The chains that had once bound him lay in a rusted heap on the floor, broken and useless. The Hollowed didn't move. They simply watched, their blank faces reflecting the cold emptiness of the prison. Declan turned and ran. He sprinted down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the silence as he fled the Hollowed. The air was cold, the shadows long, but he didn't stop. He had to get out. He had to escape. The whispers followed him, faint and distant, but they grew quieter with each step he took, until they were nothing more than a faint echo in the back of his mind. Declan burst through the door at the end of the corridor, the cold night air hitting him like a shock. He stumbled out into the open, his heart racing as he took deep, gasping breaths. He was free. Kilmainham jail loomed behind him, its dark silhouette towering over the city. The whispers were gone, the Hollowed left behind in the depths of the prison. But as Declan stood there, catching his breath, he couldn't shake the feeling that a part of him had stayed behind. The Hollowed had claimed a piece of him, a piece he could never get back. ***. The End. Story 3. The Witch's Hollow. Location: Blackwood Forest, New Hampshire, USA. Part 1. The Forest Beckons. Julia Mathers had always been fascinated by the darker side of history. As a historian with a penchant for folklore, she had spent years researching the chilling tales that echoed through the small towns of New England. But none intrigued her more than the legends surrounding Blackwood Forest. The forest, with its twisted trees and dense undergrowth, had long been shrouded in mystery and fear. Locals avoided it, citing tales of disappearances and strange sounds that came from deep within. But Julia wasn't like the locals. She was drawn to the unknown. At the heart of Blackwood Forest lay the ruins of an old stone house, believed to have once belonged to Mara Devlin, a witch who had been executed during the Salem witch trials. But Mara's story was different from the others. According to legend, she had escaped her fate by fusing her spirit with the forest, becoming one with its dark, tangled roots. The villagers who had come to hang her found only an empty noose. Her body vanished without a trace. It was said that Mara still haunted the woods, her vengeful spirit transforming the trees into sentinels that watched over her cursed hollow. Now, as Julia stood at the edge of the forest, gazing into the shadowy depths, she felt both a thrill of excitement and a prickling sense of unease. The air was cool, the sun low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. The towering pines and gnarled oaks seemed to twist together, forming a nearly impenetrable barrier of branches and thorns. Her heart raced as she adjusted the strap of her backpack, filled with notes, a camera, and her ever-present notebook. The research she'd gathered over the years had led her here, to the very edge of Blackwood Forest. She had studied the legend of Mara Devlin extensively, but now she was determined to find the ruins for herself, to uncover the truth behind the stories of the Hollow Witch. Taking a deep breath, Julia stepped into the forest, the thick undergrowth crunching under her boots. The trees seemed to close in around her immediately, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A few steps in, and the world behind her, the open fields, the distant road, faded into memory. Blackwood Forest had swallowed her whole. The deeper she went, the darker it became. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisted and gnarled, and the air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The forest floor was uneven, littered with roots and rocks that seemed to grab at her ankles as she walked. Occasionally she would hear the distant snap of a twig, or the rustle of leaves. But each time she paused, she saw nothing. Julia kept her eyes on her map, one she had pieced together from old, half-forgotten texts and local folklore. The stone house should be somewhere near the center of the forest, nestled in a small hollow that few dared to venture near. But as she walked, the trees seemed to grow stranger, their trunks twisted and warped, their branches drooping low like arms hanging in defeat. The sense of unease she'd felt earlier deepened, creeping up her spine like cold fingers. The forest felt alive. After what felt like hours of walking, Julia finally saw it. Through a break in the trees, she glimpsed the ruins of the old stone house. The walls were crumbling, overgrown with moss and vines, but the structure was unmistakable. The roof had long since caved in, and the windows were little more than gaping holes, but there was a strange, almost eerie beauty to it. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was it, the place where Mara Devlin had lived, where she had been accused of practicing dark magic. Julia could almost feel the weight of history pressing down on her as she stepped closer, her boots crunching softly against the forest floor. The house sat in a small clearing, the trees around it twisted and gnarled, their roots thick and tangled beneath the earth. The air here was different, heavier, more oppressive. The wind, which had been rustling the leaves just moments before, had fallen silent. There was a stillness to the place that made Julia's skin prickle. She pulled out her camera, snapping a few photos of the ruins, before setting it aside to take out her notebook. As she sketched the outline of the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every now and then, she would glance up, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Just the twisted, gnarled trunks and the thick undergrowth. But the sensation didn't leave her. As she moved closer to the house, something caught her eye. A massive, ancient tree at the far edge of the clearing. Its bark was blackened and cracked, its roots thick and gnarled, twisting and curling into the earth like the fingers of some monstrous hand. The tree was unlike any she had ever seen, and despite the dense canopy above, its hollow trunk seemed to glow faintly, a soft, eerie green light emanating from within. Drawn to it, Julia approached the tree cautiously. The closer she got, the more she could see how the roots twisted and moved ever so slightly, as if alive, pulsing with a faint energy. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached out to touch the bark. The moment her fingers brushed against the tree, the ground trembled beneath her feet. Part 2. The Hollow Witch. The tremor sent a shock through Julia's body, freezing her in place as the tree's roots writhed beneath her, twisting like snakes under the earth. Her breath hitched, and she yanked her hand away from the bark, heart pounding wildly in her chest. The green glow from within the tree intensified, pulsing in time with the shifting roots, casting an eerie light over the clearing. Before she could react, the roots began to rise. They tore free from the ground, twisting and coiling upward like a mass of serpents, forming a grotesque shape that towered over her. Julia stumbled back, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The ancient tree was moving, its roots weaving together, forming limbs, a torso, a face. And then, from the heart of the twisted tree, it emerged. The Hollow Witch. Mara Devlin, or what remained of her, stood before Julia, her body a grotesque fusion of human and tree. Her skin was rough and bark-like, twisted and gnarled like the roots that made up her form. Her limbs were long and thin, ending in sharp, claw-like fingers made of splintered wood. Her eyes, hollow and empty, glowed with the same eerie green fire that had pulsed from the tree's trunk, casting a sickly light over the clearing. Julia's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled back, her legs trembling with terror. This was Mara Devlin, the witch who had cursed Blackwood Forest, the woman who had fused her spirit with the trees to escape her execution. The legends had been true, but none of them had prepared Julia for the reality of what she was seeing. The Hollow Witch let out a low, rasping breath, the sound like the creaking of ancient wood. Her head tilted ever so slightly, her glowing eyes fixed on Julia, as though she were studying her, deciding what to do with her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Julia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. And then the witch spoke. Her voice was low and rasping, like the wind through dead branches, but there was an unmistakable malice in her tone. "You should not have come here." Julia swallowed hard, her mouth dry. I didn't know." The witch's hollow eyes flickered with a faint green glow. "You came to find me. Now you belong to the forest." The word sent a chill down Julia's spine. She took a step back, her hands shaking. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I just wanted to learn the truth." Mara's twisted mouth curled into a grotesque smile, her wooden fingers curling into claws. "The truth? The truth is death. The truth is that I was betrayed, hunted, and burned. And now I take from those who come into my forest, just as they took from me." The roots at Mara's feet began to shift again, snaking out across the ground toward Julia. Panic surged through her, and she turned to run, her legs finally obeying her frantic thoughts. She sprinted toward the edge of the clearing, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but the roots were faster. They lashed out, wrapping around her ankles, yanking her off her feet. Julia hit the ground hard, the air knocked from her lungs. She gasped, struggling to pull herself free, but the roots tightened, dragging her across the forest floor toward the witch. The twisted trees around her seemed to shift and move, their branches stretching out like arms, reaching for her. "Please," Julia gasped, clawing at the ground. "Let me go. I didn't do anything to you." Mara's hollow eyes flickered with malice. "Your kind always comes here. You think you can take from me, from my forest. But the forest takes what it is owed." The roots tightened around Julia's legs, dragging her closer to the witch. She could feel the life being drained from her, a cold, creeping sensation that spread through her body like poison. Her vision blurred, her limbs growing weak as the roots coiled tighter and tighter. "I don't want to die," Julia whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The witch's smile widened, her hollow eyes glowing brighter. "Then you should not have come here." Julia's strength was fading fast. Her body felt heavy, her mind foggy, but she couldn't give up, not yet. Desperation surged through her, and she reached into her backpack, fumbling for anything that might help. Her fingers closed around the cold metal of a small dagger she always carried, a relic from her years of research, something she had brought more as a keepsake than a weapon. With the last of her strength, Julia yanked the dagger from her bag and slashed at the roots wrapped around her legs. The blade sliced through the wood, and with a sharp crack, the roots recoiled, loosening their grip just enough for her to pull free. She scrambled to her feet, her breath ragged, and sprinted toward the edge of the clearing. The witch let out a low, furious hiss, the sound echoing through the trees as the roots writhed and twisted behind her. "You cannot escape the forest!" Mara's voice rasped, her hollow eyes burning with rage. But Julia didn't look back. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest, the twisted trees and gnarled roots blurring together as she fled deeper into the forest. The witch's words echoed in her mind, but she refused to believe them. She could escape. She had to. The forest seemed to shift and twist around her, the trees moving in unnatural ways, blocking her path and forcing her to weave through the dense undergrowth. The roots reached out for her, grasping at her ankles, but she kept running, pushing herself harder and faster. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she couldn't stop. The forest seemed to go on forever, an endless maze of twisted branches and tangled roots. The further she ran, the darker it became, the canopy above growing thicker and blocking out the last rays of daylight. And then, in the distance, she saw it. The faint glow of light through the trees. The edge of the forest. Safety. With renewed determination, Julia sprinted toward the light, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The roots still lashed out at her. The trees still seemed to twist and move, but she was getting closer. She could make it. But as she reached the edge of the forest, something cold wrapped around her ankle. Julia gasped, stumbling forward as the roots tightened their grip, pulling her back toward the darkness. Part 3. Into the Hollow. Julia's heart raced as the roots yanked her back, pulling her away from the light of the forest's edge and deeper into the shadows. She struggled against their hold, kicking and clawing at the thick, gnarled tendrils, but they were relentless, dragging her across the forest floor like a puppet on strings. Panic surged through her as the trees closed in, their twisted branches blocking out the last remnants of daylight. She could feel the cold grip of the forest tightening around her, as if the very ground was alive, pulling her into its embrace. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her pulse pounding in her ears. Behind her, the witch's voice echoed through the trees, low and rasping. "You cannot escape the forest! You are mine now!" Julia's mind raced, her thoughts a frantic blur of terror and desperation. She had to do something, anything to break free. She fumbled for the dagger still clutched in her hand, the cold metal slick with sweat. With a wild, desperate swing, she slashed at the roots, severing them with a sharp crack. The roots recoiled, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, Julia was free. She scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling with exhaustion, and ran. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. She just had to get away from the witch, from the forest, from the horror that was chasing her. The forest seemed to twist and shift around her, the trees moving in unnatural ways, their branches reaching out like arms, trying to pull her back. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, thick with roots and rocks that seemed to grab at her ankles as she ran. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, her lungs burning with the effort. Her vision blurred, the dark shapes of the trees blurring together into a nightmarish landscape of twisted shadows. But she pushed herself forward, her mind focused on one thing: escape. But as she rounded a corner, she stumbled to a halt, her heart sinking. The clearing. She was back at the clearing. The ruins of the old stone house stood before her, their crumbling walls casting long shadows across the ground. The ancient tree, with its gnarled roots and blackened bark, loomed at the far end of the clearing, its hollow trunk glowing with that eerie green light. And standing in front of it, waiting for her, was the Hollow Witch. Mara Devlin's twisted form seemed to glow in the dim light, her hollow eyes burning with a fierce, unnatural fire. Her bark-like skin creaked and groaned as she moved, the roots at her feet shifting and writhing like living snakes. "You cannot escape the forest," the witch rasped, her voice filled with malice. "You belong to me now." Julia's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind reeling. How had she ended up back here? Had the forest led her in circles, trapping her in this nightmare? Her hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the dagger. She was cornered, out of options, but she wasn't going to go down without a fight. Mara tilted her head, her glowing eyes fixed on Julia. "You think you can fight me, child? I am the forest. I am the roots beneath your feet, the air you breathe. You cannot defeat what you do not understand." Julia swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. The witch was right. She didn't understand the power of the forest, the dark magic that had fused Mara's spirit with the trees. But she couldn't just give up. There had to be a way out. Her eyes darted to the ancient tree, the hollow trunk still glowing with that strange green light. The tree was the source of Mara's power. She was sure of it. If she could just reach it, if she could find a way to destroy it, maybe she could break the witch's hold on the forest. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Julia took a step forward, her gaze fixed on the tree. The roots at Mara's feet shifted, as if sensing her intent, and the witch's hollow eyes narrowed. "You cannot touch the heart of the forest," Mara rasped, her voice low and dangerous. "It will consume you." But Julia didn't stop. She took another step, and then another, her legs trembling with fear and exhaustion. The roots writhed beneath her feet, but she ignored them, her focus fixed on the tree. With a snarl, Mara raised her arms, the twisted branches and roots around her responding to her command. They lashed out at Julia, wrapping around her legs and arms, pulling her back. But Julia fought back, slashing at the roots with her dagger, cutting them away with wild, desperate swings. She could feel the witch's power pressing down on her, the weight of the forest crushing her spirit, but she refused to give in. With a final burst of strength, Julia broke free of the roots and sprinted toward the tree. The air around her seemed to pulse with dark energy, the ground shaking beneath her feet as she reached the hollow trunk. The green light within the tree flickered and pulsed, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. Julia raised the dagger, her hand trembling. Mara's voice echoed in her ears, filled with rage and fear. "No! You cannot destroy me!" But Julia didn't hesitate. With a scream of defiance, she plunged the dagger into the heart of the tree. The moment the blade pierced the bark, the forest erupted into chaos. The ground shook violently, the trees twisting and writhing as if in agony. The roots beneath Julia's feet bucked and twisted, throwing her to the ground. The green light from the tree flared, blinding her, and a deafening roar filled the air. Mara let out a scream of pure fury, her hollow eyes burning with an intense, blinding light. The witch's body twisted and convulsed, the bark-like skin cracking and splintering as the dark magic that had sustained her began to unravel. The roots around Julia writhed and lashed out, but she didn't stop. She grabbed the dagger with both hands and drove it deeper into the tree, twisting the blade with all her strength. The light from the tree flared one final time, and with a deafening crack, the trunk split open. Mara let out a final piercing scream, her body disintegrating into a cloud of ash and dust. The roots and branches around her crumbled, falling to the ground in a heap of dead wood. The forest fell silent. Julia collapsed to the ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The dagger slipped from her hand, clattering to the forest floor. She lay there for a long moment, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. It was over. Part 4. The Cursed Forest. The stillness that followed was unnerving, almost suffocating. Julia lay on the forest floor, her body limp and her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The Hollow Witch was gone. Mara Devlin, the witch who had cursed the forest and fused herself with its roots, was no more. The dark magic that had sustained her had been destroyed with the ancient tree. For a moment, Julia simply lay there, listening to the silence of the forest. The oppressive weight that had clung to the air was gone, replaced by a strange stillness that felt both unnatural and peaceful at the same time. But the forest was still dark, still tangled and twisted. The trees, though no longer alive with the witch's malevolent presence, remained gnarled and ancient, their branches forming a dense canopy above. The roots beneath Julia's feet no longer writhed, but they were still there, thick and twisted, like the veins of some long-dead creature. Slowly, painfully, Julia pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled beneath her, and her body ached from the struggle, but she was alive. Somehow, she had survived. She glanced around the clearing, her eyes scanning the remains of the ancient tree. The trunk, once pulsing with green light, now lay split open and dark, its twisted roots curling lifelessly into the ground. The ruins of the stone house loomed nearby, their crumbling walls casting long shadows across the forest floor. But something was different. The air, once thick with the weight of dark magic, was now still and cold. The oppressive presence that had clung to the forest was gone, replaced by a strange emptiness. Julia's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step forward, her boots crunching softly against the forest floor. The silence was unnerving, almost suffocating, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. She glanced back at the remains of the tree, her breath catching in her throat. The hollow trunk, once the source of Mara's power, now lay in ruins. But there was something else, something just beneath the surface of the bark. A figure. Julia froze, her heart skipping a beat. The figure was faint, barely visible in the dim light. But it was there, a shadowy form, half merged with the twisted roots and bark of the tree. Its face was indistinct, its body barely more than a silhouette, but there was no mistaking what it was. Mara. Her spirit, though shattered and broken, was still there, trapped within the tree, fused with the forest in a way that even death couldn't sever. Julia's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she stared at the figure, her mind racing. The witch was gone, her body destroyed, but her spirit remained, lingering in the dark corners of the forest, watching, waiting. She backed away slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had destroyed the witch's body, but the forest was still cursed. The roots, the trees, the very ground beneath her feet were still tainted by Mara's dark magic. Julia turned and ran. The twisted trees and gnarled roots blurred together as she sprinted through the forest, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, thick with rocks and roots, but she didn't stop. She had to get out. She had to escape the cursed forest before it claimed her as well. The light of the forest's edge grew brighter ahead of her, the thick canopy of trees thinning as she neared the boundary. Her heart raced with a mix of fear and relief. She was almost there. But as she reached the edge of the forest, something cold and sharp brushed against her ankle. Julia gasped, stumbling forward as the roots tightened their grip, pulling her back into the shadows. She spun around, slashing at the roots with the dagger, her breath coming in frantic gasps. The roots recoiled, but more took their place, twisting and writhing around her legs, dragging her back into the forest. "No!" Julia screamed, slashing wildly at the roots. "Let me go!" But the forest didn't listen. The trees, though no longer alive with the witch's presence, were still cursed, still bound by the dark magic that had sustained them for centuries. The roots tightened their grip, pulling Julia deeper into the shadows, away from the light of the forest's edge. Her strength was fading fast, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. The dagger slipped from her hand, clattering to the ground as the roots pulled her down, wrapping around her arms and legs, binding her to the earth. Julia's breath came in short, ragged gasps as the darkness closed in around her. The forest, though silent, was alive with the weight of Mara's curse. The twisted trees and gnarled roots, though no longer controlled by the witch, were still part of her, still bound to her dark magic. And now, they had claimed Julia. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the faint, shadowy figure of Mara Devlin, watching from the twisted remains of the ancient tree. And then, there was nothing. The end. Story 4. The Train That Never Stops. Location: abandoned railway line, Dungarvan, Ireland. Part 1. Discovery of the Midnight Line. The countryside of Dungarvan was peaceful, idyllic even, but it held secrets. Conor McGrath had worked as a railway worker for nearly 2 decades, crisscrossing Ireland's railways, mending tracks and inspecting lines. But there was something about Dungarvan's abandoned railway system that always felt different, something unsettling that lurked in the long-forgotten stretches of track that no longer saw trains. It was late afternoon when Conor came across the old railway. He hadn't meant to find it, not exactly. The Midnight Line, as the locals called it, had always been the subject of ghost stories. Old-timers in the pub would whisper about a train that vanished in the 1920s, disappearing without a trace. Some said the train had gone off the tracks, plunging into the river, while others believed something far darker had taken place. Regardless, no one ventured near it. Most didn't even believe it existed anymore. But Conor knew better. The railway had a pull on him, an irresistible tug that gnawed at his curiosity. He had heard stories about the Midnight Line his entire life, and though his practical mind had always dismissed them as mere folklore, something about this abandoned stretch of track made him uneasy. He found the railway late in the afternoon, while inspecting a stretch of operational line not far from Dungarvan's countryside. Hidden beneath overgrown brambles and weeds, the Midnight Line was barely visible. Conor crouched down, pulling the thick foliage away, revealing the iron rails that snaked off into the distance, vanishing into the dense forest ahead. The steel was rusted, corroded by time, yet it had a strange vitality to it, as though the tracks had been disturbed recently, as though they were waiting for something. A cold wind swept through the air, stirring the leaves, and Conor felt a chill crawl up his spine. He stood and stared into the fading light, squinting at the horizon. The rails seemed to shimmer in the dimming sunlight, a faint ghostly light flickering along the length of the track. Conor had always been practical, grounded, but something deep in his gut told him to turn back, to leave the Midnight Line to its own dark history. Still, he couldn't resist walking along it, just to see where it went, just to confirm for himself that it was nothing more than an old, forgotten track. As he moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the countryside, birds, the occasional rustle of the wind, seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie silence. His footsteps echoed strangely. The crunch of leaves and gravel beneath his boots amplified in the quiet. The trees around him grew denser, their gnarled branches reaching over the tracks like skeletal arms. After what felt like an eternity, Conor stopped. The track seemed endless, stretching out into the darkness. He knelt down, placing his hand on the cold steel of the rail. It was solid, unmoving, and yet something about it felt wrong. The air here was thicker, heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Conor stood quickly, brushing the dirt from his hands. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trees, and he had no intention of staying here after dark. He turned to head back when he heard it. The distant wail of a train whistle. At first, he thought he had imagined it, a trick of the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. A long, mournful wail that sent shivers down his spine. His breath caught in his throat as he looked back down the track, squinting into the gathering darkness. A light appeared in the distance. It was faint at first, a flickering glow like the light of a distant lantern, but it was moving toward him, slowly, steadily, as if something were coming down the tracks. Connor's heart raced. There were no trains on this line, not anymore. The Midnight Line hadn't been operational in nearly a century. He knew that for a fact. Yet here it was, a train coming down the track, its whistle growing louder, more insistent, the light of its headlamp piercing the darkness. Instinctively, Connor took a step back, his pulse quickening. He should leave. He should run, but his feet were rooted to the ground, unable to move. The train was coming closer, its hulking silhouette beginning to take shape in the distance. The outline of the locomotive was monstrous, massive, and covered in what appeared to be rust and decay. The air around him grew colder as the train approached, a bitter chill that bit into his skin. The sound of the whistle was almost unbearable now, a high-pitched scream that rattled in his skull. Connor's breath came in short, shallow gasps as the train came into view. It was unlike any train he had ever seen. An ancient iron behemoth, its blackened, rusted surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. The windows of the train were dark, but through the glass, Connor could see movement. Shadows. Faces. No, not faces. Screaming mouths. His heart pounded in his chest as the train barreled toward him, its whistle shrieking like the wail of a tortured soul. He stumbled backward, panic surging through him. But before he could move, the train roared past him, sending a gust of cold, foul-smelling wind in its wake. Connor collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his body trembling with fear. The train disappeared into the darkness, its whistle fading into the distance. But the horror of what he had seen lingered, etched into his mind. He had seen them. The passengers. The twisted, mangled bodies, fused to the seats of the train, their faces contorted in eternal screams. Their eyes, hollow and lifeless, had stared back at him through the glass, pleading for help that would never come. The Midnight Line wasn't abandoned, it was cursed. Part 2. The Train Returns. Connor McGrath couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the vision of the phantom train haunted him. The monstrous locomotive screeching down the Midnight Line, the passengers twisted into the seats, their faces etched with horror. It wasn't just a hallucination. It couldn't have been. The next morning he tried to shake it off, telling himself it had been a trick of the fading light, that his mind had played tricks on him. But the memory of the train, of its decaying iron and those screaming passengers, wouldn't leave him. Something deep inside him knew the Midnight Line wasn't just a forgotten railway. It was alive. 2 days later, despite every logical instinct screaming at him to stay away, Connor found himself back at the edge of the Midnight Line. This time, he had come prepared. A flashlight, a heavy jacket, and a sturdy crowbar tucked into his belt. If there really was a train out there, he wasn't going to face it unprepared. The track lay before him, as abandoned and rusted as ever. The afternoon light filtered through the dense trees, casting long shadows across the rails. For a long moment, Connor simply stood there, staring down the length of the track, waiting, listening. Nothing. He took a deep breath and began walking along the line again, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Every step felt heavy, as though the very air in the forest had grown thicker, more oppressive. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of gravel under his boots and the occasional rustle of leaves. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, just like before. He felt it again, that same sense of wrongness that had gripped him the first time he'd found the railway. The trees around him seemed darker, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching out toward the track as though they were trying to keep him from going any further. And then, there it was. The train whistle. It was distant, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. That same mournful wail that had sent chills down his spine just 2 days ago. Connor froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He hadn't imagined it. The train was real. The whistle grew louder, and Connor's pulse quickened. He turned, looking down the track toward the source of the sound. And then he saw it. The light. faint at first, just a pinprick of brightness in the distance. But it was moving toward him, growing larger with each passing second. The phantom train was coming. Connor's first instinct was to run. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn around and get out of there, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his gaze locked on the approaching light. It was almost hypnotic, drawing him in, making it impossible to look away. As the train drew closer, Connor could make out the hulking shape of the locomotive. Its massive iron frame was covered in rust and decay, just as it had been before, but now it seemed even more menacing, as though the very air around it pulsed with malevolent energy. The windows were dark, but through the glass he could see the shadows of the passengers, twisted, contorted figures, bound to their seats in eternal torment. The train's whistle shrieked again, louder this time, and Connor felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. He took a step back, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The light from the train's headlamp was almost blinding now, cutting through the darkness like a blade. He had to get out of there. Now, with a surge of adrenaline, Connor turned and ran. His boots pounded against the gravel as he sprinted away from the approaching train, the whistle growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. The cold wind whipped against his face, the branches of the trees clawing at him as he ran. But no matter how fast he ran, the train was faster. The ground shook beneath his feet as the locomotive bore down on him, its iron wheels screeching against the rails. Connor could hear the grinding of metal, the sound of the passengers' tortured screams echoing in his ears. He glanced over his shoulder and his heart leapt into his throat. The train was right behind him, its headlamp casting long, grotesque shadows across the track. The windows were filled with the faces of the passengers, twisted, skeletal faces, their hollow eyes staring back at him in silent agony. Connor's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort. The train's whistle shrieked again, so loud it rattled in his skull. There was no escape. The train was going to catch him. Just as the locomotive was about to overtake him, Connor spotted something, a small shack, barely visible through the trees. Without thinking, he veered off the track, sprinting toward the shack with everything he had left. The train roared past him, its wheels grinding against the rails, but it didn't stop. It couldn't. It was bound to the track, unable to deviate from its cursed path. Connor threw himself into the shack, collapsing onto the floor in a heap. His chest heaved with every breath, his entire body trembling with exhaustion and fear. He could still hear the train in the distance, its whistle fading as it disappeared into the night. For a long time, Connor lay there, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. He had escaped, just barely, but the realization of what he had seen, of what he had almost become a part of, left him shaken to his core. The Midnight Line wasn't just a legend. The phantom train was real, and it was still out there, cursed to ride the tracks forever, collecting the souls of anyone it encountered along the way. And Connor had almost been its next passenger. Part 3. The Warning. Connor couldn't stay in Dungarvan, not after what he had seen. The sight of the phantom train, with its rusted iron frame and the screaming souls trapped inside, haunted his every waking moment. He couldn't sleep. Whenever he closed his eyes, he would hear the train's whistle, its mournful wail echoing through his mind, sending shivers down his spine. The faces of the passengers, their hollow eyes and twisted mouths, stared back at him in every shadow. But leaving wasn't easy. The train had changed something in him. Wherever he went, the memory of the Midnight Line clung to him, like a dark cloud he couldn't shake. He felt its pull, even when he tried to distance himself from the tracks. It was as though the train had marked him, as though it were waiting for the right moment to return. He had to know more. The old railway station in Dungarvan had been closed for years, but the records were still kept in the town hall. Connor spent hours poring over old documents, trying to piece together the history of the Midnight Line. searching for any clues about the train and its disappearance. The more he read, the more unsettling the story became. In the winter of 1923, a passenger train had been scheduled to run along the line from Dungarvan to Lismore, a route it had taken many times before. The weather that night had been bad. Snowfall heavy enough to slow the train, but nothing unusual. The midnight train, as it had been called, was full of passengers, mostly locals heading home for the holidays. But somewhere along the line, the train had vanished. There were no reports of derailments or accidents, no signs of a crash. It had simply disappeared. Search parties had been sent out, but no wreckage was ever found. The entire train, along with its passengers, had seemingly vanished into thin air. For decades, the disappearance of the midnight train had remained a mystery, and the railway had eventually been abandoned. The tracks were left to rust, the station closed, and the story faded into folklore. But the locals still talked about it. The train that vanished, the midnight line that no one dared walk. And then, of course, there were the sightings. Connor had heard about the sightings his whole life. People claimed they had seen the train on foggy nights, heard its whistle echoing through the countryside, even though the line had been out of use for nearly a century. But no one had ever been able to prove it. No one had ever come back with any evidence. Until now. Connor felt the weight of that knowledge pressing down on him as he sat at the old pub in town, nursing a pint of Guinness. He had come here to clear his mind, to escape the suffocating memories of the train. But the old stories wouldn't leave him alone. "You've seen it, haven't you?" The voice came from across the table, low and gravelly. Connor looked up, startled. An old man sat across from him, his weathered face creased with age, his pale blue eyes sharp and knowing. "Seen what?" Connor asked, his voice hoarse. "The train," the old man said, leaning forward. "The midnight train. I can see it in your eyes, lad. You've seen it, haven't you?" Connor hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't told anyone about what he had seen. Not yet. But something about the old man made him pause. There was a weight in his words, a seriousness that cut through Connor's fear. I don't know what I saw," Connor admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it was something real." The old man nodded slowly as though he had expected the answer. "Aye, it's real all right. I saw it too, years ago. Back when I was your age." Connor's eyes widened. "You've seen it?" The old man nodded again, his gaze distant, as though he were remembering something long buried. "I was working the line back in the 60s, late at night, just like you. I was walking along the old tracks when I heard it, the whistle. The ground shook, the air turned cold, and there it was, the midnight train, coming down the tracks just like it never left." Connor felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What happened?" The old man's expression darkened. "I ran. That's what happened. I ran as fast as I could, and I didn't stop until I was far away from that cursed line, and I never went back." Connor swallowed hard, his heart racing. "Why does it keep coming back? What does it want?" The old man let out a heavy sigh. "That train is cursed. The souls of the passengers, the ones who were on board when it disappeared, they're trapped, bound to that train for eternity. And now, it's looking for more. Anyone who gets too close to the midnight line, anyone who hears that whistle, they're in danger. The train takes them, drags them aboard, and they become part of it." Connor's blood ran cold. "Is there any way to stop it? To break the curse?" The old man shook his head. "No one knows. But once you've seen the train, once you've heard its whistle, it never lets you go. It'll keep coming for you, lad. It won't stop until it gets what it wants." Connor felt a wave of dread wash over him. He had escaped the train once, but how long would he be able to outrun it? How long until it came for him again? He had to find a way to stop it. Part 4. The Final Ride. Connor knew what he had to do. The old man's words echoed in his mind. It won't stop until it gets what it wants. The phantom train would keep coming for him, dragging him into its twisted nightmare unless he found a way to stop it. But how did you stop something that had been cursed for nearly a century? Something that defied the very laws of reality. As he stood at the edge of the midnight line that evening, Connor's breath came out in visible puffs, the cold evening air biting at his skin. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees, and the track before him seemed to stretch out into eternity. He didn't know what he was hoping to find. Perhaps some clue, something that might reveal the source of the train's curse. Maybe deep down, he was hoping the train wouldn't come, but he knew it would. The old man's words had been clear. Once you had seen the train, it never let you go. Connor's heart raced as he stared down the length of the track, waiting. The air around him grew colder, the wind picking up, and in the distance, he heard it. The whistle. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, but it was there. The same long, mournful wail that had haunted him since that night. The same sound that sent shivers down his spine and made his blood run cold. He turned, staring down the track, and there it was, the light. The phantom train was coming. Connor's pulse quickened, but this time he didn't run. He stood his ground, gripping the crowbar tightly in his hand. His heart pounded in his chest as the train drew closer, its hulking, rusted form taking shape in the distance. The headlamp cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the trees, and the whistle shrieked again, louder, more insistent. The ground shook beneath Connor's feet as the train barreled toward him, its iron wheels grinding against the rails with a deafening screech. The air around him grew colder, the wind whipping against his face, but he didn't move. The train roared down the track, and for a moment, Connor thought it was going to run him down. He braced himself, preparing for the impact, but at the last second, the train screeched to a halt, stopping just inches from where he stood. Connor stared up at the locomotive, his heart hammering in his chest. The train loomed over him, its iron surface covered in rust and decay, its windows dark and lifeless. But through the glass, he could see them. The passengers. Their faces were twisted in agony, their mouths open in eternal screams, their bodies fused to the seats. Their hollow eyes stared back at him, pleading for release, for salvation that would never come. The door to the train creaked open with a loud metallic groan. Connor hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the train. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay, the walls lined with rust and grime. The seats were filled with the passengers, their twisted forms bound to the iron frames, their skeletal hands gripping the armrests. Their eyes followed him as he made his way down the aisle, their mouths moving in silent screams. At the far end of the train, Connor saw it. A small dark compartment. The source of the train's curse. The engine. He stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the control panel in front of him. But there, in the center of the room, was a figure. The conductor. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, empty, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. He wore a tattered conductor's uniform, the fabric rotting and frayed. "You've come," the conductor rasped, his voice low and hollow. "Just as they all do." Connor swallowed hard, his heart racing. "Why are you doing this? Why are you taking these people?" The conductor's grin widened. "They belong to the train now. They are its passengers, bound to ride the rails for eternity." "But why?" Connor demanded, his voice trembling. "What is the curse?" The conductor's eyes gleamed with a malevolent light. "The train must ride. It cannot stop. And it must have passengers, always passengers." Connor's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. The train was cursed, bound to ride the tracks forever. But why? What had started it? What had doomed these people to an eternity of torment? Before he could ask, the train lurched forward, the wheels grinding against the rails as it began to move again. Connor stumbled, grabbing onto the control panel for support. The train was moving, faster and faster, picking up speed as it barreled down the track. The passengers screamed, their voices rising in a deafening chorus of agony. Connor's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the control panel, his mind racing. There had to be a way to stop it. There had to be something he could do to break the curse. And then he saw it. A lever, marked with a single word: release. His breath caught in his throat. Was this it? Was this the way to free the passengers? To stop the train once and for all? Without hesitating, Connor grabbed the lever and pulled. The train screeched to a halt, the air filled with the sound of grinding metal and the wails of the passengers. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything was still. And then, slowly, the train began to fade. The walls, the seats, the passengers, all of it began to dissolve into the air, turning to mist and drifting away like smoke. The conductor's twisted grin faded with it, his body disintegrating before Connor's eyes. Within moments, the train was gone. Connor stood on the track, the cold night air biting at his skin, his heart pounding in his chest. The midnight line was silent. The phantom train had disappeared, its curse finally broken. He had done it. But as he turned to leave, he heard it. The whistle. Asterisk, asterisk. The end. Asterisk, asterisk. Story 5. The Sunken Village. Location: beneath Lake Bolsena, Italy. Part 1. Into the depths. Isabella Rossi stood at the edge of the boat, staring out across the tranquil waters of Lake Bolsena. The sky was clear, the sun casting a shimmering glow across the lake's surface. But despite the beauty of the scene, Isabella felt a creeping unease in the pit of her stomach. She had been preparing for this expedition for months, meticulously studying ancient texts, historical accounts, and sonar readings. Beneath the calm waters of Lake Bolsena lay the sunken village of Valle d'Ombra, a settlement lost to an earthquake centuries ago. But something about the village, something about its history, felt off, darker than what the record suggested. The small fishing boat bobbed gently on the water as her team prepared the diving equipment. Beside her, her colleague and fellow marine archaeologist, Luca Moretti, checked the oxygen tanks for the last time. "You sure about this?" Luca asked, his voice low, almost as if he too could sense the weight of what lay below. "The legends, I mean." Isabella offered a faint smile, though her unease had been growing ever since they arrived at the lake. "Superstitions, nothing more. We've both seen what happens when history gets wrapped up in myths. I'm more worried about the equipment than any ancient serpent." The serpent in question, according to the local legends, was Il Serpente, a monstrous creature that had once lived in the depths of Lake Bolsena. The villagers of Valle d'Ombra had worshipped it, offering sacrifices to appease it, until the day they tried to imprison it. That was when the earthquake came, swallowing the entire village and dragging it beneath the waters. Isabella wasn't one to believe in such things, but even she couldn't deny the eerie nature of the stories. Local fishermen refused to sail across the deepest parts of the lake, claiming they could still hear the cries of the villagers echoing from below. Others spoke of strange shapes moving in the water, shadows that didn't belong to any known creature. Still, none of that had stopped Isabella. The chance to explore an untouched sunken village, to uncover relics and architecture that had remained hidden for centuries, was too great an opportunity to pass up. And so, here she was, about to dive into the unknown. Luca handed her the final checklist, his brow furrowed with concern. "We've got everything in place. Cameras are set, and the sonar picked up some interesting formations just below us. The village is definitely down there, but... Isabella pressed. Luca hesitated before answering. But the readings are strange. There are structures, sure, but also something else. Shapes. They're too large to be debris and they're moving. Isabella frowned. Moving? Could just be a school of fish or debris stirred up from the bottom. Could be, Lucas said, though he didn't sound convinced. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Isabella said, pulling on her wetsuit and attaching the oxygen tank to her back. We're here to do our jobs. If we find some strange creatures, great. If not, we'll bring back artifacts that haven't seen the light of day in centuries. Luca nodded, though his eyes lingered on the calm water for a moment longer than necessary. Together they moved toward the edge of the boat. Isabella's heart raced with anticipation as she adjusted her mask and regulator, her mind focused on the task at hand. The unknown lay below, but that was where she thrived, exploring what others feared. With a final nod, she and Luca plunged into the water. The cold hit her instantly, a sharp, biting chill that sent shivers down her spine. But Isabella was used to it. She and Luca descended slowly, the sound of their breathing echoing in the water as they adjusted to the pressure. The sun's rays pierced the surface, casting shimmering beams of light through the water. But the deeper they went, the darker it became. The village had been submerged hundreds of years ago, and as they approached the lake bed, the outlines of ancient structures began to take shape in the murky depths. The sonar had been right. Buildings, streets, even the remnants of a small temple could be seen, half buried in silt and mud. Isabella's excitement grew as they swam through the ruins. Here was a piece of history that had been lost to time, a place untouched by modern hands. The village was eerily well preserved, with stone walls still standing and arches intact. Luca followed closely behind her, his camera capturing everything as they moved through the underwater streets. "This is incredible!" Isabella's voice crackled through the communicator in her helmet. "It's better than I imagined!" Luca's voice was equally awed. "It's like the whole village just froze, like it was swallowed by the lake and never aged." They moved deeper into the ruins, passing through what had once been the town square. Stone statues of ancient figures stood silently, their features worn away by time and water. Fish swam lazily through the empty streets, their scales glinting in the faint light that filtered down from above. But as they ventured further, something caught Isabella's eye. At the far end of the village, near the base of a crumbling temple, the silt was disturbed, as though something had moved recently. The lake bed around it was uneven, with deep gouges in the mud that didn't seem natural. "Do you see that?" Isabella asked, gesturing toward the disturbed area. Luca swam closer, his brow furrowed behind his mask. "Yeah, it looks like something's been down here. Something big." Isabella's heart raced as they swam closer, curiosity driving her forward. The deep gouges in the lake bed were unlike anything she'd seen before. Whatever had caused them wasn't a natural phenomenon. They were too deliberate, too precise. Suddenly her flashlight beam flickered, the light bouncing off something in the distance. Something black. Something moving. Part 2, The Awakening. Isabella froze, her heart pounding in her chest as her light caught the faintest glimpse of movement in the dark water ahead. For a moment she thought she had imagined it, that her mind was playing tricks on her in the murky depths. But then it moved again, something large, shifting in the shadows, just at the edge of her vision. "Luca," she whispered, her voice shaky through the communicator. "Did you see that?" Luca swam up beside her, his own flashlight cutting through the water. He scanned the area, but there was nothing. Just the eerie stillness of the submerged village, the ancient stone structures standing silent and unmoving. "See what?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with unease. Isabella's grip tightened on her flashlight as she focused on the area where she had seen the movement. It was gone now, whatever it had been. "I thought I saw something. It looked like..." Before she could finish, The water around them suddenly grew colder. It was subtle at first, a gradual drop in temperature that sent a shiver through her. But then it became more pronounced, the icy chill biting into her skin even through the thickness of her wetsuit. The change was unnatural, as if the lake itself was reacting to something. "Did you feel that?" Isabella asked, her breath coming faster. "Yeah," Lucas said, his voice tense. "It's freezing all of a sudden." They hovered in the water for a moment, unsure of what to do. The light from their flashlights cut through the gloom, but the sense of unease that had been creeping over Isabella since they entered the water was growing stronger. Something was wrong. She tried to shake off the fear, reminding herself that they were scientists, not superstitious locals. There had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps a current had stirred up the silt, causing the strange shapes she had seen. Or maybe it was just the pressure playing tricks on her eyes. But the gouges in the lake bed remained. They were real, and they were fresh. "Let's keep moving," Isabella said, though her voice lacked the confidence she was trying to project. "We'll check out the temple and get a closer look at those marks." Luca nodded, and together they swam toward the crumbling temple at the edge of the village. As they neared the structure, Isabella's heart raced. The temple was the oldest building in the village, its stone walls covered in ancient carvings, worn away by centuries beneath the water. But something about it felt wrong, unnatural. They reached the base of the temple, where the deep gouges in the lake bed were most prominent. The ground was torn up as though something massive had dragged itself through the mud. Isabella knelt down, brushing her gloved hand across the disturbed silt. The marks were deep, too deep to be caused by any known underwater creature. "What do you think made these?" Luca asked, his voice hushed. Isabella shook her head. "I don't know, but it looks like whatever it was. It came from the temple." They both turned to look at the temple's entrance. The massive stone doors were partially collapsed, half buried in the mud, but there was enough space for them to swim through. Isabella's heart pounded as she stared at the dark opening. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But she couldn't. Not when they were so close to discovering the truth. She gestured to Luca. "Let's go inside. Maybe we can find some answers." They swam cautiously through the entrance, their flashlights illuminating the narrow hallway beyond. The walls were lined with intricate carvings, figures of people kneeling before a massive serpent, its coiled body stretching across the entire length of the corridor. Isabella's pulse quickened as she studied the carvings. The serpent's eyes were inlaid with what looked like precious stones, glittering in the faint light. Il Serpente. The villagers had worshipped the creature, but according to legend, they had also tried to imprison it. Isabella's mind raced as she considered the implications. Had they succeeded? Or had they failed, and in doing so, doomed their village to destruction? The carvings seemed to tell the story. The serpent, once revered as a god, growing more powerful, more dangerous. The villagers had built this temple to honor it, but at some point, fear had replaced devotion. The final carvings depicted the villagers constructing a massive cage, trying to bind the serpent beneath the earth. But the last image showed the serpent breaking free, its enormous body coiling around the village, crushing buildings as it destroyed everything in its path. Isabella's stomach churned. Had the earthquake really been natural, or had it been caused by something far more sinister? As they swam deeper into the temple, the hallway opened into a vast chamber. At the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, covered in thick black silt. The carvings on the walls continued, showing the serpent rising from the lake, its eyes glowing like lanterns in the depths. Suddenly, Luca stopped, his flashlight flickering wildly. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Isabella strained to listen. At first she heard nothing but the muffled sound of her own breathing. But then, faint and distant, she heard it. A deep rumbling sound like the growl of something enormous, reverberating through the water. Her heart leapt into her throat. "We need to get out of here." But before they could move, the water around them began to stir. The silt on the floor swirled up in thick clouds, obscuring their vision. Isabella felt the ground shift beneath her, and a sudden wave of pressure pushed against her, knocking her off balance. "Luca!" she shouted, her voice muffled by the water. But Luca was already being pulled away, dragged through the murky water by an unseen force. His flashlight flickered one last time before disappearing into the darkness. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she struggled to swim after him, but the water was churning violently now, the silt blinding her. She kicked harder, her heart racing with panic, but it was no use. Luca was gone, and then she saw it. In the darkness ahead, a pair of glowing eyes. Part 3. The Serpent's Lair. The eyes were like twin lanterns, glowing an eerie green in the dark water. They were massive, far larger than any creature Isabella had ever seen before. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Was it really possible? Could the legend of Il Serpente be true? The water was cold, unnaturally so, and the churning silt made it nearly impossible to see. But the eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, were fixed on her, watching her every move. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the creature wasn't just watching. It was waiting. Her muscles screamed in protest as she swam harder, desperate to escape the temple. But the water seemed to push against her, slowing her movements. The pressure around her grew, the weight of the lake bearing down on her as though the water itself was trying to pull her deeper. She glanced over her shoulder, and her breath caught in her throat. The eyes were closer now, the dark shape of the serpent's massive body coiling through the water like a shadow. Its scales were black, slick like oil, reflecting the faint light from her flashlight in strange, distorted patterns. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its massive body rippling through the water with a predatory ease. Isabella's mind raced. She had to find Luca, had to get him out of here. But the serpent was between her and the exit. She was trapped deep within the temple, with no way out. Suddenly, the serpent moved. It was fast, far faster than she had expected. Its massive body shot through the water, its long, sinuous form undulating as it moved toward her with terrifying speed. Isabella barely had time to react. She kicked hard, propelling herself backward as the serpent's jaws snapped shut just inches from where she had been. Her heart raced as she spun away, her hands trembling as she gripped the flashlight. The serpent was enormous, its body stretching through the water like a living nightmare. She could feel its presence, the sheer weight of it pressing down on her as it circled her, its glowing eyes fixed on her. But it didn't attack again. Instead, it circled her, its massive body coiling and uncoiling in the water like a snake playing with its prey. Isabella's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she realized what it was doing. It was toying with her. And then from the corner of her eye, she saw something move in the silt. It was Luca. He was alive, barely, his body floating limp in the water, his flashlight flickering weakly. He must have been knocked unconscious when the serpent first attacked, dragged through the water by the force of the creature's movements. Isabella's heart leapt with a mix of relief and fear. She had to get to him, had to pull him out of the temple before the serpent struck again. But how? The creature was still circling, its eyes locked on her, waiting for her next move. Her mind raced, searching for a plan. She glanced at the carvings on the walls, the images of the villagers worshipping the serpent, the temple they had built to honor it. There had to be something, some way to stop it, to distract it long enough for her to get Luca and escape. Her gaze fell on the altar. The massive stone structure sat in the center of the chamber, covered in thick black silt. The carvings on its surface were worn and faded, but she could make out the shape of the serpent, coiled around the base of the altar. There was something strange about it, something that didn't match the rest of the temple, and then she realized what it was. The serpent's mouth was open, and inside, there was a stone mechanism, A lever. It was a trap. The villagers hadn't just worshipped the serpent. They had tried to imprison it. The carvings told the story. They had built the temple, constructed the altar, and lured the creature inside. The lever was the key, the mechanism that would trigger the trap and seal the serpent inside the temple forever. Isabella's heart raced as she swam toward the altar, the serpent still circling her, watching her every move. She had no idea if the mechanism still worked, no idea if the trap would even hold the creature, but it was her only chance. She reached the altar and grabbed the lever, her hands shaking as she pulled it with all her strength. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, with a deafening crack, the temple began to shake. The walls trembled, the floor shifting beneath her feet as the ancient mechanism came to life. Stone doors began to slide shut, massive slabs of rock moving into place around the chamber, sealing the exits. The serpent let out a furious roar, its glowing eyes flaring with rage as it realized what was happening. It lashed out, its massive body slamming into the walls of the temple, trying to break free before the doors closed. Isabella didn't wait to see if it succeeded. She swam to Luca, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him toward the nearest exit. The water was churning violently now, the pressure growing as the temple collapsed around them. She kicked harder, her lungs burning as she dragged Luca through the water, her heart pounding with fear. The serpent roared again, its body thrashing wildly as the last of the stone doors slid shut, sealing it inside the temple. Isabella and Luca broke through the entrance just as the temple collapsed, the water rushing in behind them. She kicked harder, pulling them both to the surface, her lungs screaming for air as they neared the light. And then, with a final burst of strength, they broke through the surface. The cold night air hit Isabella's face like a shock, her lungs filling with sweet, sweet oxygen. She gasped, her chest heaving as she pulled Luca up beside her. He was unconscious, but he was breathing. They had made it. The lake was calm again, the surface undisturbed, as though nothing had ever happened. But Isabella knew better. Beneath the water, deep in the sunken village, the serpent still lurked, trapped once again in the temple it had once ruled, for now. Part 4. The Curse of the Serpent. Isabella dragged Luca onto the boat, her muscles aching from the strain of carrying his limp body through the water. The night air was still and eerily quiet, with no sign of the chaos that had unfolded beneath the surface. The boat rocked gently on the calm lake, the stars reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds. She collapsed onto the deck, gasping for breath. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Luca lay beside her, unconscious but alive. His breathing was shallow but steady. They had made it out. Barely. For a long moment, Isabella just lay there, staring up at the night sky, trying to process everything that had happened. The serpent, the temple, the villagers' desperate attempt to imprison the creature. It was all real. The legends hadn't just been stories. The sunken village had been destroyed by the very thing the villagers had once worshipped, and the creature still lurked in the depths, waiting. But they had escaped. The temple had collapsed, sealing the serpent inside once again. It was over. At least, that's what she tried to tell herself. As the minutes passed, Isabella slowly regained her composure. She rolled over, checking on Luca's condition. He was still out cold, but his pulse was strong. He would survive. She reached for the radio, her hands trembling as she called for help. "This is Isabella Rossi, aboard the research vessel *Stella Mare*. We need assistance. One diver unconscious. Coordinates are..." Before she could finish, the boat rocked violently. Isabella's heart leapt into her throat as she grabbed onto the side of the boat, her eyes wide with fear. The water around them was churning again, ripples spreading across the surface. She looked out over the lake, her breath catching in her throat as she saw something moving beneath the water. A shadow. Her blood ran cold as the shadow passed beneath the boat, too large to be anything natural. It was moving quickly, circling them, the water rippling in its wake. Isabella's mind raced with panic. It couldn't be. The serpent had been trapped, sealed inside the temple. There was no way it could have escaped, but the shadow beneath the boat told her otherwise. The water surged again, and the boat tipped precariously to one side. Isabella scrambled to her feet, grabbing Luca and pulling him toward the cabin. They had to get out of here, had to get back to shore before the creature struck. But before she could move, the water exploded. A massive form erupted from the lake, its body coiling around the boat like a living nightmare. Isabella's eyes widened in horror as she saw the serpent in all its terrifying glory, its black scales shimmering like glass, its glowing green eyes burning with rage. The creature let out a deafening roar, its massive jaws snapping just inches from where she stood. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest as she pulled Luca toward the cabin, her mind racing. The serpent was free, and it was coming for them. She slammed the cabin door shut, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she locked the door behind her. Luca lay unconscious on the floor, oblivious to the chaos unfolding outside. Isabella grabbed the radio, her hands shaking as she shouted into the receiver. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Isabella Rossi aboard the Stella Mare Asterisk. We're under attack! We need help now!" The boat rocked violently as the serpent slammed into it, its massive body coiling around the vessel. Isabella's heart raced as she clung to the side of the cabin, her mind filled with terror. The creature was relentless, its jaws snapping at the boat, its eyes glowing with fury. She had to think, had to find a way to stop it. Her mind raced back to the temple, to the carvings on the walls. The villagers had tried to imprison the serpent, to seal it beneath the lake. But they had failed. The creature had broken free, destroying everything in its path. But why? Isabella's eyes widened as the realization hit her. The villagers hadn't just worshipped the serpent. They had feared it. They had tried to control it, to keep it bound to the lake. And in doing so, they had angered it. The serpent wasn't just a creature. It was a god, a force of nature that couldn't be controlled. And now, it was coming for them. The boat lurched again, and Isabella's mind raced. There had to be a way to stop it, to calm the creature before it destroyed them. But how? The temple was gone, the trap destroyed. There was nothing left to contain it. But there was one thing she hadn't tried. Isabella grabbed the ceremonial dagger she had found in the temple, the same dagger she had used to activate the trap. It was old, its blade worn with age, but it was still sharp. The villagers had used it in their rituals, in their offerings to the serpent. She had no other choice. With a deep breath, Isabella stepped out of the cabin, the dagger clutched tightly in her hand. The serpent loomed above her, its massive body coiling around the boat, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Isabella raised the dagger, her voice trembling as she spoke the words she had read in the carvings, the words of the ancient ritual. The serpent paused, its eyes narrowing as it watched her. Isabella's heart pounded in her chest as she spoke the final words of the ritual, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. For a moment, nothing happened. And then slowly, the serpent began to uncoil. Its massive body slid back into the water, its glowing eyes fading as it disappeared beneath the surface. The lake was still once again. Isabella collapsed onto the deck, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The serpent was gone for now. But she knew the truth. The creature wasn't bound by the temple. It was bound to the lake. And as long as Lake Bolsena existed, the serpent would remain, lurking in the depths, waiting for the next time it was disturbed. As the rescue boat appeared on the horizon, Isabella glanced back at the calm water, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what lay beneath. Some things were better left buried. The end.